Little Miss Mouse by Amy Ella Blanchard. Chapter 9. Uncle Sidney. The next afternoon, Ruth and Billy had a long and earnest talk in the woodshed. The visit of her uncle had been of enough importance for Ruth to be kept home from school, and she was now in a very excited state of mind. She had waited with much impatience Billy's return from school, for there were many things which she must ask him, things which she felt she could not question Miss Hester about. She sat now upon a tall chest, her feet dangling dejectedly. There were marks of tears upon her face, and she held her hands nervously clasped. Billy sat upon an overturned box. From time to time, he flung a chip to Stray, who, with head on one side, watched eagerly for the attention, and, so soon as the chip was near enough, snatched at it, then grabbing it, played with it till it ceased to be a novelty. He then planted himself within Billy's range again, looking inquiringly for the next chip. Neither Billy nor Ruth paid much attention to his antics. "You see," Ruth was saying, "it is all for me to decide. Aunt Hester says she cannot do it, and says it must be as I say. My uncle talked and talked. He told me I should have music lessons and that I should be sent to a good school and all that. I am sure this school is good enough, and I don't care a bit about the music lessons. I'd rather know how to draw pictures than to play the piano. You know, Billy, there is only one thing makes me think I ought to go, and that is Aunt Hester. You know what you said about another mouth to feed. I'm another mouth, you know, and if it makes Aunt Hester work so hard to feed me, maybe I ought not to stay." Billy was silent for a moment and stopped throwing sticks to Stray. When he spoke, he said very thoughtfully, "I'm the one to go away, not you. I'm a boy and can make my own living." "Oh no, for you see you haven't any relations like my Uncle Sidney," returned Ruth. "And besides, who would chop the wood and do the errands, Billy? Then if you went away, who would keep store and buy back the big house for Aunt Hester? It would be foolish for you to go when I have an uncle to take care of me." With his duties as man of the house thus brought to his mind, Billy demurred. Perhaps, after all, his place was here. "If I only wasn't another mouth," Ruth went on, "or if I were a dog like Stray and could live on scraps, or if I were a cat and could catch mice, then nobody would want you," said Billy. "Indeed, they would then. There are ever so many people who like cats. If you don't, Aunt Hester does, and so do I, and so does Lucia. Oh dear, I should hate to give up Lucia. I wish I ought not to go instead of oughting to go." "Maybe you'll like it awful much," said Billy encouragingly. "Maybe your uncle has lots of boys and girls and you'll have fun with them." "No, he hasn't. He has only one little boy, about 5 years old. Billy, promise me on your sacred word and honor that you will come and get me just as soon as you begin to keep store, or if Aunt Hester gets the claim before that." Billy nodded gravely. He wished it were not right to tell Ruth that it would be best for her to leave them. He felt that he would miss her sadly, and that one small boy in the house, with a grave elderly woman, would not have as agreeable a time as when a youthful comrade like Ruth was on hand to take an interest in small matters beneath the notice of their elders. Ruth had always a lively imagination, and was vastly amusing at times. To be sure, she was very often absorbed in her doll or in Lucia Field, but at other times she and Billy had most exciting plays in which she was almost as good fun as a boy, he told her. He thought of all this now, but his loyalty to Miss Hester and his practical bent made him repeat, "I guess you'll have to go, Ruth." But Ruth had been thinking too. "I'll go, but I'm not going to promise to stay. I'm coming back the first chance I get. If I find $1,000 that nobody wants, or if I do something like saving a train from running off the track, and they give me a whole lot of money for it, or if the claim comes out all right, I'll come straight back, so I just won't think that I'm going for good, and I am going in now to tell Aunt Hester so. Don't tell her it's because you know she can't afford to keep you, charged Billy bluntly. Of course not, returned Ruth. She jumped down from her seat and went slowly back to the house. Miss Hester was sitting at the window of her room, which looked out upon the street. She had her lap full of little garments upon which she was sewing a missing button here, a tape there. This isn't Saturday, said Ruth. What are all these? She came nearer and put an arm around Miss Hester's neck. They are some of Henrietta's things. I didn't know but that you would need them, answered Miss Hester soberly. Won't my uncle buy me any clothes? He will probably buy all you need, but I don't want to have you go away unprovided for. I suppose you must go, Ruth. I should be doing you a wrong to encourage you to do otherwise. I'm not going for good, returned Ruth confidently. I am going only for a little while till something happens. If you get the claim, you know, or if I find a whole lot of money, I will come back. Even if those things don't happen, Billy will come for me as soon as he is big enough to keep store. Miss Hester smiled faintly. I am afraid it will be many a day before that. Ruth shook her head. I'm not going to think I'll be gone long. I will tell my uncle that I am going to stay only a little while, that I am coming back to you, and that I love you better than him or anybody. The feeling that this departure was in the nature of a visit made her more cheerful. Like all children, she loved excitement and change, and since she had decided that she was to return, there was only left a rather pleasant anticipation instead of a grief. It was well for Miss Hester that the time for preparation was short, for Mr. Mayfield could wait only another day, and so Ruth's belongings were hastily packed. That she might make a good appearance, the store of clothing in the chest upstairs was drawn forth, and all of Henrietta's things that were in good order were packed in a small trunk. Hetty, too, was given room, and Ruth begged that her box of pieces might go in. It will make me feel like home to see all my doll rugs, she said. And Miss Hester stowed away the box just as it was. At the last moment, Billy, who had been struggling between his love for Ruth and his love for Stray, came forward, insisting that Ruth must take the little dog with her, since he belonged half to her and could not be divided. But though Ruth would have liked dearly to have him, Miss Hester decided otherwise. You don't know that your uncle's wife would be willing to have a dog in the house. Indeed, I think it is quite unlikely that she would consent to your having him, for there is the little boy to be considered. I think you are awfully good, Billy, to want me to have him, Ruth declared, and I'd just love to take him, but you see, I have Hetty for company, and you won't have anybody to play with but Stray. But Billy was determined that she should receive some token, and from his little hoard, which he was saving up for Christmas, he took out sufficient to buy a gaily flowered mug, upon which was written in gold letters, "From a friend." Ruth thought it was beautiful, and begged Miss Hester to pack it very carefully. I will use it every day at table, she said. Then, after whispering to Miss Hester, she left the room and returned with a red silk handkerchief which Dr. Peasley had once brought her after a visit to the city. I want you to have this to remember me by, she said to Billy, and he accepted the gift solemnly. At last, the little trunk was packed and stood waiting. Then Ruth went to make some hurried farewell calls. To all inquiries, she replied that she was going to her uncle's to make a visit, but that she expected to be back soon. So often did she repeat this, that she persuaded herself it must be true, until the last moment when the possibility of its not being merely a visit faced her, and she flung herself into Miss Hester's arms in a passion of weeping. I don't want to go. I don't want to go, she sobbed. You needn't, dear. You needn't, whispered Miss Hester herself, feeling very heavy-hearted. But just then, Billy came rushing in, shouting, "He's come in a carriage, Ruth, to take you to the station." And the dignity of such a departure for the moment caused Ruth to check her tears. It would be a triumphant exit, she considered, and after one last frantic hug and the passionate reiteration, "I am coming back soon, I am," she obeyed her uncle's call and was helped into the carriage, her trunk being already established by the side of the driver. She waved her handkerchief from the carriage window. Her last glimpse of the brown house showed Billy at the gate holding up Stray for her to see. Miss Hester was not in sight. She had gone indoors where no one would observe her tearful eyes. Soon the carriage turned into the main street. The children were on their way to school, and to Ruth's satisfaction, they passed Nora Petty, to whom Ruth gave a condescending nod. She was riding away into new splendors where Nora could no longer twit and tease her. As the train moved out of the station, there came over the child an overpowering desire to jump out and run back to Aunt Hester, who loved her, to Billy and Stray, to the little brown house which she might never see again. The big teardrops rolled down her cheeks. She wiped them furtively away as she kept her head turned as if looking out the window. Her handkerchief became a damp little ball in her hand, and the telegraph poles, as they flashed by, were seen through a watery mist. Her uncle wisely said nothing to her for a time, but absorbed himself in his newspaper. But when the train boy came along, he bought some fine fruit and a box of chocolates, saying cheerfully, "Here, little girl, don't you want to see what is in the box?" Her thoughts diverted in such an agreeable way, the worst was over for Ruth, and she turned to the sweets for solace. After a while, her uncle began to talk to her, to tell her of his home, of his little boy, Bertie, and from this he went back to his own childhood when he and Ruth's father were playmates together. So, the morning was not very long, though Ruth was glad when she climbed down from the cars to take luncheon at a station where they tarried for half an hour. It was late in the afternoon when they arrived in front of her uncle's door. Ruth observed what to her was a very fine house, and when she entered the hall, she was quite overcome, for, to her inexperienced eye, it appeared a mansion, magnificent beyond her highest expectations. They had hardly entered before a piping voice called out, "There's Papa," and swiftly sliding down the baluster came the figure of a little boy. He came with such speed that he nearly fell off when he reached the big newel post, but his father caught him. "You rascal," he cried. "What did I tell you about doing that?" "It's so much the quickest way to get here, Papa," said Bertie. "What did you bring me?" "I brought a little new cousin." Bertie turned and regarded Ruth with anything but an amiable expression. "I don't want her," he said. "I want something nice. Didn't you bring me any candy?" Mr. Mayfield looked rather abashed. "To tell you the truth, son, I didn't," he began. But Bertie interrupted him with a loud wail. "Mama! Mama!" he cried. "He didn't bring me any candy, and you said he would." Then, throwing himself down on the floor, he kicked and screamed violently. Ruth heard the swish of silken skirts, and down the stairs a lady came swiftly. She was very fair and looked quite young. Ruth had never seen anyone dressed so wonderfully, and she stared with all her eyes at the vision. "What is the matter with my darling?" cried the lady. "Oh, have you come, Sidney?" She gave Ruth's uncle a cheek to kiss. "What is my precious boy crying about?" she asked, bending over the raging child. "Papa didn't bring me any candy, and you said he would," hollered Bertie. "You are an old—" There, began his mother, gathering him into her arms. "How could you be so forgetful of the precious child, Sidney?" she said reproachfully. "Well, you see, Lily, I had so much to think of. Oh, by the way, Ruth, this is your Aunt Lily. Did you get my telegram, dear?" "Oh, yes, it came all right, of course," replied Mrs. Mayfield petulantly. "You ought to have given me more notice." "How could I? My letter explained why." Ruth stood awkwardly by. She had not received a very warm welcome, for Mrs. Mayfield only nodded and said coolly, "How do you do, little girl?" Bertie's howls continued. "I wish I had something to give the child to pacify him," muttered Mr. Mayfield, who saw that no one would receive much attention until Bertie's fit of rage was over. He turned apologetically to Ruth. "You don't happen to have any candy, do you?" he whispered. Ruth promptly produced the box of chocolates, which was but half empty. She had been so much more abundantly fed than usual that she had not been able to eat all the candy. "Just give them to Bertie," whispered Mr. Mayfield, "and I will get you some more." Ruth obediently slipped the box into his hand, and he gave her a smile. "Here, Bertie," he said. "See what Cousin Ruth has for you. Papa didn't bring you any candy, but Cousin Ruth did." At this, Bertie rushed from his mother's embrace and grabbed the box from his father's hand. "'Tain't but half full," he whined. Then turning, he gave Ruth a push. "You mean old Fing?" he cried. "Why didn't you bring me a whole box?" "Now, Bertie," said his mother, "that's not a pretty way to talk. I am sure you ought to say, 'Thank you,' to your cousin. Won't you say, 'Thank you'?" "No, I won't," returned Bertie, beginning to gobble down some of the chocolates as fast as he could. Ruth was shocked. Such an ill-mannered child she had never seen. She felt mightily ashamed for him. "I suspect Ruth is rather tired," said Mr. Mayfield. "You'd better show her to her room, Lily?" For answer, Mrs. Mayfield touched an electric button, and a neat maid appeared. "Take Miss Ruth to her room," said the lady, "and help her dress for dinner, Katie." Ruth followed the girl up 3 flights of stairs, catching glimpses on the way of rooms whose elegant furnishings seemed to her fit for a palace. At the top of the house, she was ushered into a hall bedroom, comfortably, even prettily, furnished. It looked out upon the street, but it seemed to Ruth, accustomed to her little room adjoining Aunt Hester's, a long way off from anyone, and she wondered if she would not feel afraid up there. She timidly asked Katie who had the next room. "Nobody, miss," was the reply. "It's one of the spare rooms, but it ain't often used except when there's more company than common, but I sleep just down the hall in one of the back rooms." This was comforting, and Ruth felt relieved. The trunk having now arrived, Katie fell to unpacking it. She smiled at the old-fashioned clothes, but made no remark, being too well trained a servant for that. She selected Ruth's very best frock, a cream-white delaine with small Persian figures upon it. The frock was trimmed with an old-fashioned gimp, heading a narrow fringe, but its quaintness suited Ruth and she looked very presentable, Katie thought, as she led her downstairs when a soft-toned Japanese gong announced that dinner was ready. Chapter 10. Homesick. In spite of such luxuries as Ruth had never before enjoyed, and the fact that there was little restraint put upon her, she did not feel in her new home a real content. After a week, it was decided that she should not go to school, Mrs. Mayfield insisting upon a governess who could give some attention to Bertie. One was found who suited the lady, but to whom Ruth took a dislike at first sight, and never thereafter did she feel comfortable when Mademoiselle Delarme's sharp eyes were fixed upon her. Lessons in French and music were those upon which Mademoiselle laid the most stress. The rest amounted to little. Mademoiselle was sly and put forth her best efforts to please Mrs. Mayfield, and, consequently, made much of Bertie. Ruth, though well-clothed and fed, starved for those things which she craved. She longed for her Aunt Hester's loving notice and appreciation. She sighed for Billy's bluff companionship, and she was very, very lonely. Her uncle was absorbed in business, and she saw him seldom. He always gave her a kind smile when they met, asked if she were well, and if she needed anything, and there the interest ended. On several different occasions, he had given her money, telling her to spend it on whatever she liked, but she, with a wise frugality, had saved nearly every penny till her hoard amounted to nearly $5. At Christmas, she would perhaps spend it to send home gifts to those she truly loved. Mrs. Mayfield was fond of society and was rarely at home unless to entertain some guest. The children had their meals in the nursery with Mademoiselle, took their drives and walks with her, and although Bertie would not be kept within bounds and frequented any part of the house at will, Ruth rarely went beyond the confines of the nursery. She still had her little hall bedroom, and Mademoiselle was now given a room upon the same floor, though Ruth would have preferred her to be elsewhere. J'ai, tu as, il a, crooned Ruth one afternoon as she sat in the nursery, studying a lesson. Oh dear, I don't want to study French, she sighed. It won't be a bit of use to me, for when I grow up I shall go back to Springdale. I may go sooner than that. None of the girls there will learn French. Well, perhaps Lucia will if she goes away to boarding school, and perhaps Nora might. I reckon after all I'd better study it, for Nora might get ahead of me and say things to Lucia that I couldn't understand. So she bent herself again to her task. J'ai, tu as, il a, nous avons, vous avez, ils ont. Her eyes wandered from her book. She looked out of the window to where a pair of sparrows were fussing and quarreling on a twig nearby. There was little else to be seen but roofs and chimneys, a church spire in the distance, and a line of fence enclosing backyards. Her eyes returned to her book. J'ai, tu as, il a. I think I know that. Now those horrid exercises. Why should I care anything about the brother of his aunt? It doesn't make any difference to me whether she has a gold shoe or not. French is so silly. We never talk about such things. At this moment, she heard Bertie's hurrying step upon the stair, and presently he came dancing into the room, crying, Yeah, I've got it. Ruth looked up quickly to catch sight of Bertie jumping around the room, holding aloft her precious Hetty. She sprang to her feet in an instant and snatched the doll away. Bertie flew at her in a transport of rage, but she held the doll tightly, though he kicked and yelled. The commotion brought Mrs. Mayfield, who chanced to be at home. What is it, precious? She cried as she entered the room. Ruth won't let me have that old doll, and I'm going to get it, I am. I'll smash it all to pieces, cried Bertie, dancing up and down in a fury. Why don't you let him have it, Ruth? Said Mrs. Mayfield. I'll get you a better one. I don't want a better one, replied Ruth fiercely. I don't want any but this. There isn't another like her, and you couldn't get me one that would be half so dear. Well, I am sure you are very disobliging, said Mrs. Mayfield. Never mind, Bertie. If you want a doll to play with, Mother will get you one much prettier than this. Don't want it. Want one to smash, cried Bertie. Oh, but you don't want to smash Ruth's doll, do you? Asked his mother in a coaxing tone. Yes, I do. It's ugly, and I'm going to. Make her give it to me, Mama. Do give it to him, Ruth, continued Mrs. Mayfield. I will give you a much handsomer one. You shall go downtown with Mademoiselle and choose any you want. But Ruth held steadfastly to her own. I don't want any other, and I couldn't give this away to be broken up, she said. She's the only one of the family I have here to remind me of my home, and I can't give her up. Whereupon, Bertie burst into screams of anger and disappointment, flinging himself upon the floor in one of his fits of temper. After all your uncle has done for you, I think it is a very little thing to ask, said Mrs. Mayfield in an offended way, addressing Ruth. Then, meeting no response, she took a different tone. You must give it to him, Ruth. I wish you to obey me. Oh, Aunt Lily, I can't. The tears came into Ruth's eyes as she held Hetty more tightly. I command you, returned Mrs. Mayfield, haughtily, and then all Ruth's defiance was aroused. "I won't," she said. Then she started for the door. "I reckon you wouldn't give your child either to be torn to pieces by a wicked thing," she cried as she reached the door. She hurried upstairs, feeling that here was an occasion which did not demand obedience, yet frightened at her speech. There was not a day when she was not called upon to give up something to Bertie, to sacrifice her pleasures, her time, her possessions, to his whims. "He is younger than you," was always the plea, and Ruth, though not always with a good grace, yielded the point. But here was an issue which she felt was a different one from any that she had been called upon to meet. "It isn't right. It isn't," she said over and over to herself as she climbed the stairs. "Aunt Hester wouldn't make me do it. I know she wouldn't. Why Aunt Hester loves Hetty and Dr. Peasley does, and Billy, and why they would think it as bad as throwing a baby to the crocodiles like a heathen mother. I'll have to hide you, Hetty, darling, like Moses in the bulrushes, or like they had to hide the babies from wicked old Herod. Bertie is just like Herod, so he is. I don't love him one bit, and I am going to write to Aunt Hester and tell her all about it. Oh, where can I hide you, my darling Hetty, so the wicked evil foe will not seek you?" Bertie's screams still ascended from the floor below, and Ruth could hear his mother trying to comfort him. "Did that naughty Ruth tease my baby? Wouldn't she let him have the ugly old doll? Never mind. Mama will let Katie take him downtown and get him something nice. What does baby want?" "Want Ruth's doll?" persisted Bertie. "Oh, but wouldn't you like some nice candy and a pretty toy? Let Caddy dress you and take you out to get you something nice. We won't get Ruth anything, will we? She shall not go with you and Katie." Ruth's lip curled as she heard this. "Silly talk," she murmured. She had no great respect for her Aunt Lily. At last, Bertie was pacified and was led away by the long-suffering nurse, while Ruth remained in her room. Mademoiselle was out for the afternoon, and when she had completed the task the governess had set her to do, she would be free to do as she chose. Bertie seldom descended upon Ruth, and indeed, she was careful to have nothing within reach of his mischievous fingers, but today she had left Hetty sitting upon the bed, and Bertie had discovered her. It would never do to leave her anywhere in sight again, nor could she keep her where an older person than Bertie might find her. Ruth did not trust Mademoiselle, and believed if Bertie persisted in wanting the doll, as he was very likely to do, that Mademoiselle would not hesitate to find Hetty and give her into the little boy's ruthless hands. She closed her door softly and looked around the room for a hiding place. None seemed possible at first, but at last Ruth discovered a safe one. A small window seat had been placed before the one window. It opened and shut like a box. Between the back of this box and the wall under the window, there was a space over which a small board had been placed to cover the space which was caused by a slight jutting out of the window, making an irregular opening. Ruth found that she could lift the board, shove it back in place, and cover it again with the cushion of the seat. She gave Hetty a loving kiss and stowed her away in this retreat. "You mustn't be afraid, dearest," she said. "Nothing shall hurt you. I shall not let anything smite you by day nor by night. I'll pray that the angels will watch over you just as much as if they could see you in bed with me. I shall take you out every day and lock my door so we won't be disturbed." And she went back to her French exercises with a cheerful face. When she had completed them, she heard the clamor of Bertie's return and ran back to her room. Her aunt treated her with cold disdain when they next met, and Ruth gave her head a little defiant toss. "If she spies me, I reckon I can spies her," she told herself, and more than ever she kept out of the way. She had been in her aunt's rooms but seldom, though the magnificence of them charmed her. On the dressing table were such beautiful shining things. The soft couch was piled high with wonderfully embroidered cushions, and the whole place was always redolent with some faint, sweet odor. The costumes which Mrs. Mayfield wore, too, were such as Ruth thought fit for a queen. Once or twice she had seen her sweeping down the stairway in exquisite evening dress, and she wondered what Nora Petty would say if she knew Ruth were living in the same house as such a fairy-like being. Although she gave a wondering admiration to all the beautiful things with which her Aunt Lily surrounded herself, Ruth gave her aunt no affection, for she did not demand it. She treated the child with tolerance, but that was all. Bertie occupied the only place which she had in her heart for children, and him she spoiled and petted till all natural good in his nature was smothered by indulgence. Bertie did not forget the doll in spite of the candy and the new toy with which his mother had provided him, and the very next day he climbed the stairs to the top floor bent on finding Hetty. It was sufficient for Bertie to be denied a thing for him to want it beyond anything else. He looked around the room. No doll was in sight, but on Ruth's washstand stood the little flowery mug, Billy's parting gift. Possessing himself of this, he went down to the nursery where Ruth was reciting her Je tuas illa. "I want Ruth's doll," he said to Mademoiselle. "He can't have it," returned Ruth quickly. Mademoiselle looked sharply at her. "Why not, Mees?" "Because he only wants it to break up, and I can't have her smashed all to pieces." "I want to play with her. Mayn't I play with her?" whined Bertie. "You may play with her, of course. Go get this doll, this poupée, but say first what is doll. It is poupée. Repeat." Poupée, repeated Ruth obediently. "Say, then to your cousin, I give you my doll. Je vous donne ma poupée. Repeat." But Ruth did not repeat. Instead, she stood silent. Mademoiselle's little eyes snapped. "Repeat, I say. At once, tout de suite. Je vous donne ma poupée." "I can't," replied Ruth in a low tone. "I would be telling a story because I am not going to give him my doll." "You are not when I say?" Mademoiselle sprang to her feet. "You sal, you Mees, I make you." Ruth faced her, very pale. "What will you do?" she asked slowly. "I punish you. Then I will tell my uncle, and I will ask him too, if I must give my precious doll to Bertie to break up. I will tell him all about my Hetty, and I know he will not make me give her up." "You miserable little mouse. You souris which pretend so shy and meek and have the viciousness of a rat. You shall not defy me. Antoinette Delarme." Just at this moment, Bertie entered, having taken his cause into his own hands. "You'd better give me your old doll," he threatened, holding behind him the mug which he had brought from Ruth's room. "You'd just better, or you'll be sorry." "I shall not do it," said Ruth steadily. For answer, Bertie dashed out in the hall, held aloft the mug for a moment, and then flung it down over the baluster. It went crashing into 100 bits upon the marble tiling in the hall below. Having thus spent his fury, Bertie dashed away with an impish look over his shoulder. Ruth flew downstairs without a word from Mademoiselle. The butler was sweeping up the broken pieces. "Oh, Martin," said Ruth, "it is my dear little mug. Bertie got it from my room and threw it down here. Can it be mended, do you think?" With a grim smile, Martin showed the pieces. The tears came to Ruth's eyes. "And Billy bought it for me with his own money," she said, her lips quivering at the remembrance. "Oh, Martin, please let me have one little flowery piece to keep," she said. The man held out the dustpan, and Ruth selected a piece upon which a rose still showed entire. "I'll keep this forever," she said. "Thank you, Martin." The man shook his head as he looked after her, making her way to the upper floor. "That spoiled young un," he muttered. "I'd just like to see him get one good spanking." Mademoiselle sat up stiff and uncompromising when Ruth returned to the nursery. "Baby," she said contemptuously as she perceived Ruth's tears. "What is it to weep for? A little cheap something as that?" "It wasn't because I thought it was very fine," said Ruth, "but it was because Billy gave it to me. I was going to drink my milk from it at the table, but I saw it looked funny with the other things, and so I kept it in my room. Bertie knew I loved it." "He is but an infant," returned Mademoiselle, "but because he have bestowed upon you a punishment, I will not more punish you for the disobeying me, except that I make you a longer lesson tomorrow. You are repeat all the verb, to have, all. "Oh, Mademoiselle, it will take me every minute to learn it." All, repeated Mademoiselle with a wave of her hand as dismissing the subject, and Ruth, with a rebellious feeling in her heart, went to her task. She listened that evening for her uncle's latchkey, hiding herself behind the heavy curtains of the library. As his step rang upon the tiled floor, she went to meet him. "Well, Ruthie?" he said kindly. "Are you the only one at home?" "Aunt Lily has gone to a tea," she replied, "and I don't know where Bertie is. Uncle Sidney, do I have to give him my doll?" "Your doll? Bertie doesn't play with dolls, does he? He wants mine." And then Ruth told him how she came into possession of Hetty, of how Henrietta had come to grief, ending with, "And there isn't another one like Hetty in all the world, Uncle Sidney. I love her so dearly." He put his hand on her head. "No," he said, "of course you don't have to give her up. Lillian certainly spoils that boy," he added half to himself. Then, to Ruth, "If anybody wants to interfere with your belongings, little girl, just send them to me. I'll speak to your Aunt Lily about this." And Ruth was going away, satisfied, leaving her uncle to his newspaper and the comfort of the library fire, when he called her back. "Here are some picture papers," he said. "Don't you want to look at them?" He produced a bundle of papers, unrolled them upon the table before her, and she felt a warmth of heart at the unwonted attention. Mrs. Mayfield, coming a few minutes later, looked with surprise at the child absorbed in the pictures. Ruth was rarely seen at that hour. Mr. Mayfield glanced up from his paper. "See here, Lily," he said. "Don't insist upon Ruth's giving up her toys to Bertie. I won't have it. You spoil that boy." "Oh," said Mrs. Mayfield, giving Ruth a little contemptuous glance. "She has been telling tales, has she?" "She has been defending her rights," returned Mr. Mayfield, "and I don't want the occasion for it to come again." Mrs. Mayfield raised her eyebrows. "Such a tempest in a teapot," she said, walking out of the room. Ruth shot her a glance from under long lashes as the trailing velvet robes disappeared, a glance that was quite as scornful as Mrs. Mayfield could summon to her own face.